Well, I'm Peter. I worked for Williams for a long time.
The first day of the second Barcelona test, early days of course, but yesterday one of the significant points.
I think Daniel Ricciardo can pull off an amazing win again. I think something weird will happen. I'm trying not to say the obvious, but I think he could do it. Yeah, I think it's a sort of thing. Very good question. I think I'm lucky to have had a career, and still having a career hopefully, in which I've done a million different things in Formula One. I've been a journalist, I've done television, I've written, I've managed drivers, I've managed race teams, I've done the sponsorship, I've done the race team management, I've managed drivers, I've got a 3D animation company which we do Formula One animations for FOM, for FOM. So I think if I had just done one thing all my life, I would be probably saying now, well, I'm a bit bored with Formula One, I've done that. But because I've seen it from so many different angles, I think I've been able to adapt to the way Formula One has evolved or changed over the years. And of course it has. And a lot of my colleagues don't feel as buoyant about Formula One today as I do. And I think it's because I've just been lucky to have seen it from so many different angles. But what do I love about it? I love the purity of being able to sit in a car, preferably an open wheel car, single seater car, and do with that car what you will on a circuit, given the radii of the corners and the physics of G-load, and managing that G-load in a way that I saw Jim Clark managing it when I was lucky enough to see him in the late 60s drive, and to do that in a harmony that is very, very difficult to achieve. And that to me is what it's all about. I'm not massively into close racing or exciting racing or idols or any of that. I just love the idea of driving a racing car on the absolute physical limit. So I'm a purist, and for me, the drivers that I respect most from the past are guys like Sterling Moss, Jim Clark, Jackie Stewart, and then in later years, Michael Schumacher at his peak, and today, Lewis Hamilton and probably Max Verstappen. The question I'm often asked is the most significant changes in the sport. I suppose in recent times, the most significant change has been the absence of cigarette advertising and the amount of money that's fallen out of the sponsorship pool for the teams. Not necessarily for the race promoters, but for the teams. And they are adapting only slowly to the new regime of it's a big hard world out there to raise sponsorship, and by which time the budgets that they have to achieve are so high, still born of that tobacco era, that they're all struggling. Even McLaren are struggling to find title sponsorship now, and 15, 20 years ago that would be unheard of. I think that Formula One does need to adapt in many ways right now. It's just starting to discover social media, sort of 10 years behind the times. But it's difficult because it's a capital intensive sport. You need the money up front. It's not a prize money sport. And so therefore it's structured completely differently to every other sport on the globe. And that's why it is slow to adapt, because the guys who are in control of the sport and have the power to change things are so focused on paying tomorrow's wage bill and so focused on making sure they get to the next race that the bigger picture of where the Formula One brand needs to be globally and how it needs to grow is often not neglected, but it's often left to for another day, for a rainy day. So a lot of changes will take place, I guess, as the teams realize how difficult it is to raise money, as they are already. Costs will continue to come down, and the racing economy will simplify itself by evolution. It'll have to, and by natural evolution. And I think the business of making sudden rule changes of the type we have now are a function of that genesis, because there are many issues that need to be dealt with, but there's a lot of band-aids being put on short term at the moment, and that's what we're seeing. That's what we saw with that new qualifying regulation this weekend. The quality of the people. It's more difficult to talk to those very high quality people in a Formula One paddock these days, because there are more security guards, there are more closed doors than there ever used to be. And that's because the teams are having to generate so much money and having got their own car and their own design, which is exclusive to them. They're very protective of that in a way they never used to be. But when you can bump into somebody, which you do every day, obviously, if you're working in the industry, there's always people there that make you think, you know, I need to go back to school here. This guy's a very clever, intelligent person. And that's what is so attractive about, for me, for Formula One. Usually you can say that a Formula One person who also appreciates aircraft and is musical has the edge over somebody who's a bit more basic. You know, Jim Clark used to play the violin and learned to fly and went solo in 15 hours. It's just part of being a racing driver. And those things are, you know, they add to it. And if you look at a guy like Lewis Hamilton, I always get a thrill chatting to him. I always learn something from him every time I talk to him about racing and probably about life as well. And he's a very well-rounded person. So yeah, I enjoy being with Lewis. Kimi, I enjoy being with as well. I find him to be a very simple but equally complex person who's very intelligent, much more intelligent than he's given credit for. And Max Verstappen, he's 17, 18, whatever he is, and I learn from him every day, every time I talk to him as well. So I guess it's a great place to learn about people, about life, and how to educate your brain. Well, obviously Bernie Ecclestone has done a powerful job over the last, well, since '81. The key to his success were twofold, I think. One was enabling Max Mosley to become the president of the FIA, and because Max was so close to Bernie, that effectively gave Bernie the control of both the FIA and the rest of the motor racing world. So the world was his oyster for 20, 30 years until Max had to resign. And the other element of Bernie's stewardship is his understanding of the Ferrari logo and the brand is bigger than that of Formula One, and that if Ferrari ever left Formula One, it would kill Formula One. And he's done a very good job, therefore, over the years to make sure Ferrari have just enough rope, financially speaking and politically speaking and performance-wise with the car, always to stay in Formula One. And there was a time when they used to miss races because they used to get the hump about starting money and things like that. So Bernie, under the table, if that's the right phrase, has done a very good job of looking after Ferrari, often to the frustration of the other teams who don't have the vision to have such a big picture. And my feeling is that when he goes, there will be nobody on the planet Earth who'll be able to have that same relationship with Ferrari and keep that same balance of power. And we'll see some of the so-called big players, the Mercs, the Red Bulls, wanting to have equal status with Ferrari, which will be a slippery slope to some serious problems, because Ferrari alone are quite capable, if they wanted to, of creating their own world championship beyond the FIA's power, building circuits around the world, doing their own TV deals and creating a championship which is their own Ferrari championship, which other teams would be invited to take part of. They could kill Formula One overnight if they wanted to. They're that big. Nobody else could. Mercedes pulled out tomorrow, Formula One wouldn't die. If McLaren pulled out, it wouldn't die. But if Ferrari pulled out, the Formula One world would be struggling. And that's always something that Ecclestone has done very well, I think. Kept that balance and kept that economy as rich as it is. Rich in the genuine sense of the word, not necessarily the financial sense. Well, for me over the years, yeah, I am a purist, and equally, I'm probably quite biased. I learned from a journalist called Dennis Jenkinson, who's probably the best of all English language journalists ever. No longer with us, sadly. He used to write for Motorsport magazine, but he was my guiding light as a kid. I used to read his reports, endless reports, 4,000 or 5,000 words long per race. And he once said to me, an objective journalist is a boring journalist, so don't ever be objective. So I've never been objective, I've always been subjective. And quite early on in my life, Jim Clark became the only driver that I really thought about, and everybody else was and also ran. And then Jimmy went, and the next driver that captured my imagination was Carlos Reutemann, the Argentine. And I was very close to Carlos for about 5 years in his Formula One career, effectively managing him, enabling him to go, for example, from Brabham to Ferrari and then Ferrari to Williams, and giving him quite a lot of help and advice, I hope, along the way. And then Carlos retired, but simultaneously Nigel Mansell was coming up, and I met Nigel when he was in Formula 3, saw him drive. I was immediately impressed by his style in the racing car, the way he drove the racing car, and I was convinced then that he would be certainly capable of winning Grand Prix if he was given the right chance. And so I then spent about, looking back now, I guess 10, 12 years of my life helping Nigel get from nothing in Birmingham, from converting his garage into a gym and hitting a punch bag every day because he wasn't getting any drives, and then going for a 12-mile run wearing army boots because nobody had rung him that day. And that was a year when he did only 3 races. And being his buddy at that point, and then taking him all the way to Formula 1 and being team manager when he won the World Championship in my team, that was pretty cool, you know, and that was a feeling, that was a kind of a line drawn in my career. So then I went into television, and since then I've been close to Jarno Trulli. I think he was a very underrated driver. Not very good when the car lost its balance, but if it was a car with very good grip front to rear, he was almost as quick as anybody I've ever seen. I was pretty close to Ayrton Senna in his early days. We kind of grew apart when I was with Nigel at Williams and he was at McLaren for obvious reasons. And today, I mentioned it already, but the 2 guys that I would get out of bed to watch on an empty circuit driving around all day would be Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. I love the way they drive, and I love the inputs they have, foot and hand inputs. They are absolutely brilliant. Well, Lewis fan that I am, I do think it'll be Nico, not because he won the Grand Prix here in Australia. I did actually, I work for Chinese TV, and I was asked who I thought would win the Grand Prix, and I said I thought it'd be Nico. This was last Thursday. Only because I think Nico will benefit the most of the 2 drivers from this regulation in which the radio control is restricted now. And I think he's going to be able to do more with the data on the steering wheel than Lewis, who's not that interested in data and technology. He just wants to drive the race car. And we saw a little bit of that yesterday. That was the first time that both drivers had to start with a single paddle clutch. And Nico, from the dirty side of the road, actually made a better start than Lewis. Having said that, a Ferrari engine Formula 1 car always makes a better start these days than a Mercedes engine Formula 1 car, custom or otherwise. So Mercedes do have some work to do in the way the torque is put down on the road now. But Lewis made a terrible start. That was the end of his race, and Nico did his thing.